Hello everyone and welcome to Blended Graphics. I'm Jason Ortega and today we got another fun Photoshop tutorial in store for you and I think you're going to like it. So for today's tutorial, I actually do have all of the links for all the stock images that I'm going to be using for this tutorial. So if you want to follow along, please do so. You can go ahead and check out those links below. My goal for the channel is to start doing more tutorials where you can access all of those links for the images. I do get a lot of feedback wishing that the images were there. I know a lot of times I use images from Envato Elements and you gotta have a license to do that, but I definitely understand the educational purposes of having those links, so that is my goal, to start doing more tutorials like that for you guys. So with all of that said, I think it's time we can go ahead and check out this tutorial. Let's jump right to it. Alright, so here we are with a 1350 by 1080 canvas size. Here's our background image. Controller Command T, we're just going to stretch this and scale it up so it fits our whole canvas. We're next going to turn on our main subject, and I've already extracted her from the background, so I'm just going to shift and click on this layer mask so we can get rid of that background. I'm then going to hit Command T so I can scale her up a little bit to make sure that it's obviously the right size for our environment, and place her somewhere right here in the middle. Alright, maybe adjust her just a little bit more. That's perfect. And I'm going to make a copy of that, convert this top one to a smart object. That way I have a backup. So for this bottom one, we'll just drag this down to our backup group folder. I always like to have one of those just in case. Now, using the elliptical marquee tool, I've added a layer mask to our ground. So for here, we're just going to try to get that right shape of the hole that I want to have her coming out of here. So something like this, and then we can fill that with black. Now at this point, I want to make an extra copy of this girl, so hit Controller Command J to make that copy. This way we can have one subject in front of that hole and one from behind, and you'll see why in just a second, because we're going to paint back some of that grass, and I need to have that subject behind so that way we can still see that character. Alright, so I've turned her off, and I'm going to go to one of my grass brushes here, and at this point we're just going to paint white, so that way we can bring back some of the grass texture of our image here that we have in our background. And I want to do enough so you don't really see that bottom curve of that elliptical on there anymore. So something like this I think will look really nice, and we can turn our subject back on. Add a layer mask, and then using that same brush, we're going to paint black on our subject. That way we can, again, just kind of make sure that everything is taken care of and clean. And this is why we have that extra copy behind our marquee selection, so that way we can still preserve the integrity of the image and we're not cutting into that. Alright, looks good. Now at this point we're going to go to the layer mask of the background. I'm going to switch brushes to one of my custom made grass brushes, and I have a video tutorial on how to make this brush that you can always check out. It's a great brush that works for grass textures as well as fur textures. So for right now, we're doing the same like we did to the front, just trying to get rid of that shape in the curve in the back there so it looks nice and organic. All right, so that's gonna do it. Let's go back into our backups group, and I'm going to upload here a dirt texture that we're gonna use. So let's go ahead and just call this dirt, turn it on. Controller Command T, and I want to rotate this so that way we can use the lighter portion at the bottom. Let's just use this picture to our advantage. Lower the opacity, and then we're going to warp this to try and keep that same curvilinear shape and keep that integrity. So let's just stretch this out a little bit here, something like so. All right, and we hit that check mark, and then I'm going to command click on that hole, shift command I to invert that. And then on the layer mask, we're going to paint black and cover all of this up, everything but that whole selection. All right, so let's turn up the opacity and drag this underneath our main subject. And I'm just going to tweak up the dirt just a little bit more. Okay, good. And I'm going to switch back to our grass brush that we were using. And I'm going to paint black on this dirt layer mask because I want to exaggerate the grass texture just a little bit more in that layer where the grass is meeting the soil. And what we're going to do here in just a second, once we've got this at that texture, is add a new layer at the bottom, sample one of these dark tones of the grass and fill that in, so that way you can see that little layer. All right, great. And I'm just going to quickly touch this up here, the edge of our girl. It wasn't nice and clean as I originally thought it was, so I'm just going to take a second to adjust that. So now that that's taken care of, we're adding a levels adjustment so we can match the lighting levels of our subject to that of our background. So what we mainly need to do is just shift these shadows to the right as well as our midtones slightly, and that should do the trick. So now on top of that, let's go ahead and put a color balance adjustment layer and clip it below. And we just want to move these sliders to those cyans, blues, greens, mainly because that is obviously what our background has for tone. So we just want to make sure that that matches. And let's go ahead and put a new layer on top of this. One of the tricky things with our original image is that the lighting is different than what we're using it for. So what I have to do now is we just want to sample a lot of these different skin tones on her and paint some of this back in so that way we don't have these harsh shadows at the bottom side or behind her legs, because we are going to have our main lighting source coming up from underneath. So I want to make sure that that is lighter. And like I said, we're just taking our time with this, very low opacity, and just using different tones of her body to try and get rid of some of these harsh shadows. Okay, so that's enough that I can work with it going forward here. And I'm just gonna take a quick second to get myself a little organized. Okay, great. Let's add a levels adjustment on here. And I just want to create just slightly more contrast than what our original image is. So let's just bring in the shadows as well as those highlights. Okay, that looks good. Now at this point, I want to go ahead and start introducing some of that light coming from the hole. So we're going to switch to a nice gold color here, something like that. And on a new layer using a soft round brush, we're just going to slowly start to paint some of this light right basically where the soil meets that grass. So we're going to do this in a couple of stages. This is just the first one here. Use a low opacity to start out with. You know, don't go hard first. Slowly build up this effect. And then let's give our layer a name. Once we do that, we want to double click that layer. We're going to go down to that blend if option, Alt or Option click on this anchor point so we can divide that. And we want to drag this to the right a little bit so that way we can bring some of those darker colors from underneath and have that peeking through the light. And there's that before and after. All right, so now we have a new layer that we're going to add this on. We're going to clip it to the dirt this time. And for this, let's switch up that tone to something a little bit lighter. And this will mainly be kind of like the base at the very bottom part of this hole here. Basically where the light source is coming from. So we want to brighten that up. And for this, we'll cycle through our blend modes. And we'll probably stick with this overlay. I think that looks good. And we can touch it up just a bit more. All right, so at this point, I'm gonna add another layer because I want to switch up the colors. So let's call this glow number 3. And in fact, I'm just gonna switch the names around so that way we have the layers in order here. All right, so going back to now glow number 2, we're just gonna switch up the colors. Again, something a little bit different, give it some more variety. That looks nice. And we're gonna go over that same area. We are going to have a fourth and final glow layer. In that fourth one that you're gonna see here in just a second, we're gonna add that on top. And we're gonna go to our brush properties. Let's condense the brush tip. That way it's gonna help us basically guide our light into a direction instead of being spaced out as if it were an open brush tip. And right now, if you're new to Photoshop and still kind of learning the shortcuts here, if you use your left or right bracket key, that'll increase or decrease the brush size. If you use the left or right angle bracket key, that will rotate the brush tip. So just some things to think about, again, if you're still kind of new to the shortcuts. I'm gonna open this brush tip back up again, and then we can just do some final corrections here. So just like before, going back to blend if to bring some of the darker tones from underneath peeking through. And let's check out the before and after. Okay, we're definitely making progress here. I did notice some issues around here by the legs. So what I'm gonna do is go to that first subject that's in the front, and we're just gonna paint black with a soft round brush on that layer mask. And we do have the duplicated subject underneath, so that's what's coming through. So no worries about that. Let's just erase some of that to help blend that in. All right, perfect. And now what I wanna do is I've already created a copy of our subject here. We're gonna have this one as a backup, but what I need to do with this backup copy is I just want to use the pen tool to create a selection of this part of the ladder. If you see that back half of it, there's a really harsh shadow going on there. And obviously that wouldn't really exist with all that light coming from underneath. So with this, we're gonna right click, make a selection, and then press Command J to make a copy of that selection. And then we're gonna just drag that over to that left side of the ladder. So let's bring this up here and then Command T so that way we can rotate this if we need to. And we just wanna align it. We wanna lower the opacity a bit on this so that way we can see kind of how we're working underneath if everything is lined up properly. So something like this should line up just the way we want it to. And now let's go ahead and add a layer mask to that, and we're going to invert that. So now when we paint white on that layer mask, we're going to reveal that brighter portion of the ladder that we duplicated. And all I've done here was I just command clicked on our subject just to make sure that we're staying in the lines. And that should just about do it. Alright, that's looking really good. Let's go ahead, and what I want to add now here is an exposure adjustment layer. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to decrease the overall lighting on the ladder. Overall, it's a bit too bright, so we're just going to darken this up a bit. And then we're going to invert that mask by pressing Control or Command I and just painting some of this back in, so that way we can just overall have a more of a decrease in our lighting levels. And then on top of that, let's go ahead and throw a color balance adjustment layer at the very top. And let's start dragging some of these sliders more to the warmer tones. And then what we're going to do, same thing like the exposure adjustment layer, we're going to invert that layer mask. And then let's just paint some of this back in, predominantly more towards the bottom of that ladder. Just kind of warm that area up because that's where the light is going to be reflected off of the most from the light coming from the hole. So I'm thinking our subject's in a good spot here. We're going to add a couple of exposure adjustment layers. We're going to add one for our shadows and one for our highlights. So for this first one, we're just going to use it for our shadows. Let's decrease that, invert that layer mask, and then we can just give it an S for our shadows. And now we're going to repeat that same process, but this time with the exposure adjustment layer, we're just going to move this cursor to the right. So that way we can increase these. And then overall, we're going to make some global adjustments on our subject in terms of highlights and shadows. We're going to start with the highlights first and just kind of get our opacity set here the way we want it to. So something really low. And now we're just going to paint some of this back in. Obviously the area that's closest to the bottom will be the brightest area because that's going to be closest to the light. So that's what I'm touching up here and bringing some of that light back in. And then we're switching to our shadows and then just darkening some of this area up. She's basically going from a daytime scene into something nighttime. So we just want to make sure that that is reading accurately. So the next thing I want to do is add a new layer at the very top, and we're going to clip it below. And I just want to do a little bit more in terms of touching up some of the skin here. So I'm just sampling some of the colors, and I just want to kind of get rid of this really harsh highlight that's going on towards the top. So I just want to blend that in, try to make it a little bit more realistic in terms of the setting that we're in. All right, very nice. And then right where our glows are going to be, I want to create a bit more separation because where the top of her head is, it's just starting to get a little lost with our background. So one way we can create this separation, as you can see, I just sampled some of those bright colors in our sky, and we're just going to do a couple of dabs here to give it a little bit of glow. But having her as a very dark color with the background being light, that's going to give us that separation that we need. We will ultimately add a bit of Gaussian blur to the background as well, but we'll do that at a later time. And so I'm just going to go back to our subject yet again to just do a couple bit more areas in terms of touching up. And really what's just kind of going through my mind at this point is the area that's getting closer to that jacket will probably be a bit more darker than the rest of the body. So that's why I'm just darkening up that area of the leg. And right here by the calf muscle, I don't really like the tone that's going on there caused by the glow. So I'm just erasing that part of the layer. And we mainly kept adding all those adjustment layers to the top subject, so we need to go to the one behind and add an exposure adjustment layer to that to brighten that up a bit, and that's going to help us out a lot better in terms of our lighting. Alright, let's go ahead and refine some of these details a bit. To kick things off, let's go ahead and put a solid color adjustment layer at the very top, find a nice gold color to use and clip it below. And once we do that, we want to cycle through these blend modes. I'm thinking about color dodge, and we're going to invert that mask. And this is going to start our highlight and enhancing and exaggerating some of this light here. So we just want to go, and I'm quickly going through this, just some of the areas that is obviously going to be a bit more lit than the rest of our image. And we just want to make sure that we're not going all the way up the ladder, just kind of tapering off a bit. And I forgot to erase this part. Oops, let's go ahead and do that real quick. take care of that. And now back to our regular program. Let's continue moving forward. We're gonna add another layer on top. Let's find a lighter yellow to use for this one. It's just gonna be a secondary level of highlight that we're gonna add on. Make sure that we're using a soft round brush, and this is gonna be more for that rim light that we're gonna use. Again, don't go all the way up the ladder, just kind of fade away as the further that you get towards the top here. Make sure that we're hitting the back part of this ladder as well. And with your personal projects, take your time and just try to put yourself in this image and think to yourself, okay, where is the light really gonna have the most interaction with our subject? And from there, just try to make your best guesses as to what to give that highlight to. Okay, so there's our before and after. And just to preserve some of that detail from behind, we're just using the blend if to bring some of those darker points back. And we can even go ahead and just lower the opacity down. All right, so let's add yet another layer on top of this. And this is just gonna be another highlight. Let's switch up the colors a bit. And we're just gonna get right back to work doing what we were doing before. I'm at a 4% opacity, very, very low here. And right now I'm just exaggerating some of these portions and creases of the jacket. So let's lighten some of these areas up. And we can even transition to parts of the legs, give that a little bit of highlight and some rim light just around the edge there. And for the sake of the tutorial, I am going a bit on the faster side. And I can't stress it enough, if this is my personal project, I would really take a lot more time with this and try to be a lot more precise in terms of where I'm giving these highlights to or shadows to. So I'm just gonna take a few more seconds with this, touch some areas up, and then I'll be back with you all in just a second. Alright, and now to make sure that the bottom leg is getting the same highlights, we're going to add a highlight layer on top of our back copy here, and then just do the same thing, just give that a bit more of that highlight color that we added to the top subject layer. Okay, that looks pretty good from far away. I'm gonna go back to that original highlight layer that we were working on, just do a little bit more modifications on this and touching some more areas up on here. So I'll spend another few more seconds with this and touch some areas up. I'll be back with you again in just a second here. Honestly, I could spend a lot of time doing this, but I think you get the picture. Let's move on. Let's add a color balance adjustment layer. We're going to warm up some of these tones here. I don't want the entire body to be those bluish tones underneath, so we're just going to invert this mask, and then again by the legs predominantly, we're just going to warm up some of the foundation there. Okay, and as we zoom in here, you'll notice that in real life, we're not going to have the shadow underneath the foot since the light's coming from underneath. So we're just kind of cheating here, sampling some of these colors of the ladder and just painting that in with a soft brush. And then at a very, very thin brush tip, we're just going to put in some little darker strokes to give it that texture. You're not really going to notice from far away. It'll all look pretty cohesive. And now we just need to make another modification to this ladder. We added another layer. We're going to change up the color to something similar to the highlights we've been using. And we just want to change the shadows of the ladder and make them highlights. Now, in a perfect world, you want to find stock images that have the right lighting sources to what you're going to use for your composition. Sometimes that can take way too long to find, and sometimes those pictures don't exist. So you just got to cheat sometimes, and that's what we're doing right now. We're just going to manually paint some of the light back in. And for this top step, it doesn't need to be as intense since it's going to be furthest away from the light. So we basically tackled the majority of the highlights coming from the light source from underneath. Now we need to do the highlights coming from that moon and from the light in our background. So we're switching up to one of those lighter colors. And let's just start around the edge of the hair here. And I am using 100% opacity, just trying to stay just on the outside of that edge to slowly introduce some of that light. And then we can move towards the hands here, making sure that that is getting the proper highlights that is needed. Now, as you're applying this rim light to our subject here, what you really want to try to avoid is just doing one thin line across the entire edge. I mean, if that's the look that you're going for, then by all means do it, but in terms of reality, it's not quite realistic, so try to be as organic as possible when you're doing this. And at this point too, I'm just going to erase some of the parts of the edge just to try to finesse it a bit more. And when we're applying these highlights, just keep in mind that we're using a very bright tone against a dark background, so we want to use a low opacity to slowly build up this effect. The same would obviously apply if things were reversed and we're applying a shadow to a bright background. You just want to slowly build up that effect and just use a low opacity to start off with, even a low flow too if you want. Now at this point, we only have a couple more areas that we need to apply this highlight to on our subject, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, take a few more seconds to apply that and make those corrections. I'll be back with you in a second once all of that is complete. Alright, one final little detail I want to add to our subject is just adding a little bit more light on top of the hair. So we added a new layer on top, and we're just going to touch up and make this top part of her head just a bit brighter. And we don't want to go overboard with this. And then we're going to double click on that layer once we have this complete here. Go down to our blend if, and again, just kind of break up these anchor points at the bottom to bring back some of those darker portions from underneath. Alright, so our subject is pretty much done here. We're going to move on. We're going to start creating some fireflies. So I have the stock image here. It's not a firefly. I actually believe it's just like a mosquito, but you're not going to tell from far away. So we're just going to quickly extract this from the background. It doesn't have to be very perfect because, again, it's going to be very small. So no need to worry about the details here. Alright, and once we connect this, we'll right click, make a selection, and then you want to press Ctrl or Command J to create a copy of that mosquito. And then let's just go ahead and transform this. Essentially, we just want to move this out of the way, away from our subject so we can work on it. Shrink them down a bit too. And then to start things off, let's apply an exposure adjustment layer. We just want to darken this up to kind of help match the same tone of the rest of our environment here. We're going to just paint back some of this light, mainly where it's going to be glowing. So something like this. And then on top of that, we can throw a hue and saturation adjustment layer. Make sure that is in colorize and find like a nice green and saturated a bit here. And then on top of that layer, we're going to add a solid color adjustment layer. Find something like a bright yellowish green tone. Clip it below, put this into a color dodge blend mode. We're going to invert that mask and then just make this pop just a little bit more at the bottom side here. And then this is going to be our template for our firefly. Let's highlight all of these layers and then press Command G to group them together. We'll give it a name. And then we want to duplicate this group by pressing Command J. That way we have a backup. We're going to turn this into a smart object and create many copies so that way we can use this. We're first going to shrink this down. Let's do that first before we make those copies. There you go. Make lots of copies here. And then we can turn all of these off except for the second to last one. And then at this point, we're just going to drag, rotate it a little bit, give it some variety. If you need to scale it up or down a bit more, you can do that. Again, variety is the name of the game here. So let's speed through this. I'll be back with you in a second once that's all in place. Okay, now that our fireflies are in place, we're going to add a new layer at the very top in this group here, and we're going to start our glowing process. I'm just using that same color that we had for our body. And I believe I'm just at 30% opacity here, just giving it a once go around to brighten things up. We're going to add another glowing layer on top of this once this is done. So let's just go ahead and finish this up. And let's add that second layer. Now we can drop the opacity quite a bit here. And then for this, we can actually increase the brush size using that right bracket key. And then we're going to go around with a second layer of glow, just to make this pop a bit more. Alright, so I think the fireflies look good. We're at the point now where I want to go ahead and just give our background a bit of a Gaussian blur. So I'm going to duplicate the background image. and then turn that bottom one off. The top one we'll right click, turn it into a smart object. And at the very top, we just want to go to filter, down to blur to Gaussian blur. We'll keep it at this 2 pixels. And then that layer mask, we're going to invert that by pressing Control or Command I. And then pretty much in the background, right where our subject is, we just want to paint white on that to make that a bit more blurred. We can even go into our foreground with the grass and just kind of blur some of these areas as well. We just want to navigate the audience's eyes to our subject. Alright, so I think this is gonna work just well for us, especially what I have in mind. And the next thing I want to go ahead and add on here is a lantern for our subject. So let's go ahead into our backup group. Let's bring this to the top, and I've already went ahead and extracted this from the background of its original image here. So let's press Ctrl or Command T, and we're just going to transform this and scale it down quite a bit to the size that it would normally be in real life. And we're just going to place this somewhere around these top steps. Let's zoom in a bit, and then we can even rotate this some and just move it to where we need it to be. And then we're going to switch to a hard round brush. We can soften it up a little bit. We're just going to kind of fake a handle on this. So I'm sampling a shadow color of our lantern, shrinking down a brush size. And then we just want to kind of, let's make sure that this is at 100% opacity. But yeah, just kind of draw a handle that goes around the back part of the ladder. For the left side, I'll just use the pen tool to create a path. And then we're going to right click that and then stroke the path. Okay, so to make this pop and glow, we're going to add a solid color adjustment layer, a nice orange tone, put this into linear dodge blend mode. We're going to invert that mask, and then just a couple of soft dabs just right on the light source there, just to help brighten that up. But now, because we've added another object to our scene, we're going to have more light interaction. So we're adding an exposure adjustment layer into our main group subject, and we're just going to darken some of this area up where there would now be shadow because of this lantern that we've added. But because we've added that, now we're going to have more light interaction, so we're going to have to play on that as well and make some modifications to our main subject, and that's what we're going to do now here. And for this layer, we're going to cycle through our blend modes. Now there is no right or wrong blend mode to use, just whatever your personal preference is. I'm going to stick with overlay, maybe switch up the color just a little bit on this to see how it looks. All right, we'll go with that, invert that mask, and now at this point, we're just going to add some of the highlights that is going to be created with this lantern that we've added to our scene here. So at this point, just like what we did before, I'm going to take a few more seconds with this, kind of go over some of these areas on our subjects to add that highlight on there. So I'll be back with you once that's all done here in a second. All right, that'll be good for now. Let's go ahead and add a layer behind our subject, and we're going to give this a bit of a glow as well. So let's switch back to that orange tone and increase our brush size and give it a couple of dabs behind our lantern. Something like that. All right, and then on top of this, we'll add another layer. And for this, we can add a bit of a glow and highlight to some of our grass here at the bottom, where obviously there's going to be some light interaction because of that lantern. So once we have this in place, we'll double click that layer, use blend if to just make sure that it's only hitting those brighter portions. And then we can add a little bit more. Okay, I'm thinking this is starting to look pretty good, especially what I've got in mind. We can touch up just a little bit more here. And I'm even going to drop down the opacity just a bit more. And now at this point, the composition is pretty much done. I'm just doing some final tweaking to our subject and everything else in our scene here before we put everything together through the camera raw filter. So I'm adding a bit of a highlight to the bottom of our sandal. And then I want to go to our lantern, make it a smart object, and then add a bit of a Gaussian blur, something around the 0.5 pixels will be fine. Let's add a bit more light interaction with our subject. Okay, and then we want to do the same thing too with the backside here with the light from behind. Just kind of change that up a bit. Maybe add a bit more glow onto the leg. And we definitely don't want to forget about adding a bit of a shadow on top of the foot here. But folks, I think it's time to merge all of these together at the top, convert it to a smart object, and then go ahead to filter, down to camera raw filter, and we'll make some final adjustments here. Let's start with our kind of the basics here, add a bit more contrast, maybe playing around with the shadows a bit. We can turn up the clarity, and then come down to the saturation. We'll boost that up just ever so slightly. And then we can come down to the details, add some sharpening to this, and at the bottom slider here, we can move that to the right so that way the sharpening is not applied to the entire image. And then let's come down to, actually we don't want color grading, let's go to color mixer. We'll shift the yellows a bit more to the orange, and then let's go to luminance. And then we can brighten up some of those oranges and yellows as well, make those pop a bit, even the greens for our fireflies. Okay, so I think that looks good. And then for the color grading, we'll come back here and do some modifications to that. And then lastly, we'll come down to our effects tab, add some grain, and then give it a bit of vignette. And then let's just go to this drop down menu here. And then we can go down to the feather tab and then just move that to the right, play around with the roundness a bit. But that's gonna do it. Let's hit OK. And let's check out the before. Okay, and then let's see what it looks like after. In fact, I want to do some final modifications real quick, last second. I'm going to go back to the dirt group tab here and add a new layer. And what I want to do is I want to darken this up a little bit. We'll find a nice dark brown to use, but just on the edge here, I'm going to quickly give it a bit more dimension. It was looking a little too flat for me, so I just want to make this last minute correction. I'm also going to do some final tweaking on that leg as well. Looks kind of off. Alright, so something like that. We'll go to blend if, play around with some of these sliders here just to bring back some of those darker points, even those brighter points as well. Alright, we'll hit OK. And then see the before and after on that. Maybe lower the opacity. Okay, yeah, alright, now let's go back to our girl here, and just on the leg there, it was looking kind of funny there. So let's add a bit more color and highlights to that. Okay, then we'll do a little bit more here. Perfect. Now we can go back to the top, condense them all together and create a smart object. And then if you alter option, click on the camera raw filter modifications above and drag that down. That'll just create a copy and apply it to this. And here is our new and final image that we have. And I'm quite pleased with how everything turned out. Again, if this is your own personal project, I would obviously spend a bit more time on some of this to just fine tune some of the details. But all in all, I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial. If you ended up following along with this tutorial with the stock images that were provided, please tag me on Instagram. I'd love to check out what you've done. If you even want to make some modifications so that's not exactly perfect the way I did it, I encourage you to do so. That will just only help with your own personal creativity and your learning experience as well going forward. But friends, the video's gone on long enough. It is that time. So again, just want to thanks one more time to all of you that watched the video. I hope you're getting a lot out of this and learning from these videos. Again, that's just kind of the main point of these videos and what I'm putting together for you. So I hope you are learning. In the meantime, please be safe, take care, and I hope to have you back here at Blend & Graphics for our next tutorial. See you real soon.